endowing the Sylvia Williger Memorial Shabbaton Fund, enabling us to bring in, and I was wrong, this is our fourth. This is our fourth Shabbaton. I forgot about Mark Lee Raphael, who came. So we had Professor Firestone, we had Mark Lee Raphael, we had last year from HUC, 2 years ago, right? And then, no, it was last year. It was 2020. And now 2021. Anyway, Stuart Williger founded and endowed this fund, which has enabled us to bring in some really top scholars, and I'm truly very grateful to Louis Fishman, actually, I guess I got to say, I'm very grateful to David Fishman, who told me about his twin brother and his accomplishments and led me to buy the book, which led me to find Louis Fishman and invite him to be part of our Shabbaton this year. So it's been a great opportunity for us. We have learned so much from you in our short time. I was just blown away, both by the information on Friday and then this morning as well. And I know that we have even more learning to do this evening. And so without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Louis Fishman for tonight's presentation, Israel in a post-Netanyahu era.
Thanks so much, and really it's great being here again for the third time. I don't think I've been to synagogue this much in a very long time, and I did it all in 24 hours, so I have at least 6 months off. But no, Bezrat Hashem, I'll come back before then. Okay, so yesterday night we started with the sort of adventure of talking about Ottoman Palestine. And then we moved to Turkey, where we went from Ottoman times to the modern era. And now the last talk I'm giving it's sort of based on a very depressing article that I wrote for Haaretz in May, and we're going to come to that in a second. I've been dismayed, upset for the last couple of years. Seeing the path the country is going into in Israel. You could say it's more than a couple of years. But there was something that I found very interesting, was how did Netanyahu manage to be in power from 2009 to 2021, and adding the years from 1996 to about 1998, 99, before Ehud Barak won. Of course, he came after his first election. He was elected following the assassination of Rabin. Then Shimon Peres became prime minister and lost the vote by a couple of thousand votes. And that really changed the course of history. In history, we don't do what ifs, what happens if Rabin would have lived, what happened if Shimon Peres would have won the elections. Shimon Peres, of course, someone that is huge in Israeli history. Unfortunately, just last week, I don't know if you read about 2 or 3 weeks ago about the accusations, it came out of sexual assault against some of the women that he worked with. And that's something else that we could see that's inherent within, unfortunately, with the Israeli society. We know that President Katsav also sat time in jail for rape also. It's a very, very bleak hard things to talk about, I think. Very, very hard things to talk about. So this is not a sexual assault, it's not a left or right issue, right? It's something that it crosses over. But I'm coming back to Netanyahu, and Netanyahu, in my eyes, led a revolution in Israel. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So first of all, we have a picture of him here. People might not, some people here I'm sure noticed over the years, some people perhaps knew about this, but Likudniks, people from the Likud, from the right, wear ties and suits. Labor people wear t-shirts and button-up, Rabin a button-up shirt. And Shimon Peres did wear suits also, but he was his own unique thing. Usually, so this is very Netanyahu in a suit, very good speaker. It's hard to imagine that he's the opposition leader today, and that's something. So let's look at Israel in post-Netanyahu era. So how did, in my eyes, Netanyahu change Israel? And I'm not going to say this is for the better. Is first of all, he minimized which is good in itself, he minimized the conflict, the Palestinian conflict, to something that we have never known before. And that is, there are almost no deaths from Palestinian terror attacks over the last, every year you might come down to 1, 2, 3 people, you might have one incident here, but nothing like the 80s, the 90s, or certainly not the second Intifada. Now we can argue how this happened, or that you could say that, when a new president comes in, you say, inflation is not because of Biden, it's because what Trump did, or you can say that. But when it happens on something good that happens on someone's clock, of course they're going to claim it. So the wall was built years before that in the process. But also we have to remember the Palestinian strategies changed also. But that doesn't interest most people. The most interest is that it minimized the conflict. And they made it a conflict that you can manage. It's a manageable conflict. Unfortunately, for Palestinians, this remains maximized. Okay? And that is, if you want to go from Nablus to Bethlehem, you can't go through Jerusalem. You have to go all the way around. And of course, the new settlements are trying to cut into it, so they're not going to be this contiguous piece of land for them. So that's going to be future questions. We'll look at that. But the idea is, it's transformed the conflict that we have not seen since the beginning, since 1920, I would say. This idea that you've managed to minimize it. Now, when you minimize it, you have a new generation was raised not knowing the terrible days of the second Intifada. Parallel to this, it's raised on social media. Thus, escape from political realities become more possible. Young Israelis don't know the conflict as it was. They hear stories about it. They don't know where the green line is either, to tell you the truth, many of them. So for younger people, I base this on, I have a daughter who's 22 who was raised there, and they go back and forth. They have friends. Sometimes they have friends in the territories. It's not the territories. They don't use the word shtachim. They don't use this word. This word is, I'm like the young people want it. Absolutely not. They don't know that language. They know the green line, but they don't know where the green line, and it doesn't really interest them, this idea. So it's not like the old generation where you had a divided older group would say, our children won't go here, or our children will allow them, or, and still the far majority of the Israelis never go into the West Bank. That's something different. But that's, so what Netanyahu, through the strong economy also, through the neoliberalism system or capitalist system, Israelis actually have a booming economy for years. It's booming. You go to Tel Aviv. When I take my groups, I take students to Turkey, and I did one Israeli-Palestinian conflict class. I took them to Tel Aviv. I said, look how many cranes are in the sky. There's building non-stop there, 24 hours a day. So this new Israel is a very different Israel. Young Israelis don't know the conflict, but they also live on Instagram or TikTok, and they don't know the borders as people. Their borders are virtual borders now. So that's also something that I think will prolong the conflict also in the end. So which at times I say lead to an easier life. Most Israelis also, if we go back 30 years, to go abroad used to be a big thing. Today, already by the 90s it started changing. Today, even families that aren't well off or are not even middle class can afford at least one trip to Greece a year, one trip to Turkey, one trip to Paris, Budapest, or Bucharest. Okay? They can go and they can feel like, wow, we're now part of that We didn't have this because we were poor, but now everyone can go abroad. And so making peace, regional peace, is even less important. I'm talking about with the Palestinians, actually. You have exit from there. The exit is through Ben Gurion. And it's quite impressive how many Israelis go abroad, how busy that airport is for 8 or 9 million people. So I think this is how Netanyahu changed Israel. Now, on the other hand, he decimated the left parties. He delegitimized the left parties, and even started referring to them as traitors, as people that are selling off Israel. And that is where, in retrospect, he won against Rabin. Remember, they were the two arch enemies. Rabin much older than him. So he succeeded in decimating the left parties, which will have a long-term effect. We're coming back to that. Now, some of the more negative things: control the media, or at least he managed to bring in pro-Netanyahu pundits, all the while completely ignoring the media. So before the last 4 rounds of elections, it was almost 2 years before he met with his Israeli, press conferences. Years went by, he refused. He would meet international press. Israeli press he wouldn't meet. And not by chance, the 2 or 3 court cases against him right now for corruption was paying off the media. Okay, and that's what it was, to get good coverage. And it was, who is the man, I suddenly forgot his name, in Las Vegas, the billionaire, Sheldon what? Adelson, yeah. He opened up a free paper in Israel. It was very pro-Netanyahu. And Netanyahu, the head of Yediot, which is the most popular paper, they go to Netanyahu and they say, you know what, your paper is so popular, it's free. It's being passed out every day in buses, and it's always just very, very pro-Netanyahu. Do us a favor, tell Adelson's paper that they have to cut down a bit, and we'll make a deal and give you good coverage. So these are all on tapes, and this is part of the corruption things. Also, we have something like Yahoo or Google. It's Walla. He also met with one of the heads of Walla and said, "I want good coverage." Okay, and this is important. So he succeeded in bringing pro-Netanyahu pundits that they're still there. They always say, for example, after he lost the election, well, it's not going to last long. Well, it's going to change. So it's not like they have their own Fox News, but they have pundits in key positions that are able to always sow doubt about the left and other things. And the last thing is create strong ties with pro-U.S. alliances in the Gulf, such as the UAE and Bahrain. This is a very positive thing. In the end, we're going to come back to that also. Now, this is the sad truth, that there is no conflict led to mass civil unrest and attacks in May. So that bubble that everyone was living in, I wrote an article in May, and it was very bleak. It talked about the media. It talked about how he's managed to take in the police force over, influence them. And my editor wrote the title. We don't give the titles. And she wrote, "How is Netanyahu leading us to civil war?" And I read the headline. I said, that's a little harsh. And really 12 hours later, violence breaks out in Israel. If you remember this last May, it was such a sad scene to see people, citizens of the state, Arabs, Jews, attacking each other, lynching each other, attempted lynches. If you saw in Bat Yam, someone who was Jewish, they thought he was Arab, was almost killed. Arab was killed. It was crazy. And so that shows that, of course, the conflict is there. The conflict is there. It's been buried quite nicely and packaged quite nicely since then, but it can spark like that. So May 2021, we saw the worst case scenario. We saw massive violence break out between Jews and Arabs in Israel. We saw numerous Israeli pundits claiming on the TV over and over again that this war was started for him to win the election. Just that claim by serious people should put a red light in our mind that, wow, something's not working, right? And at the same time, the Sheikh Jarrah, there's a piece of land in Jerusalem that is the most controversial point of conflict between Jews and Arabs right now. And there's these homes that in 1948, the Jewish residents were evicted. They had to go to the new Jewish state. And remember, Israel didn't own Jerusalem or didn't control Jerusalem from 48 to 67. I'm talking about the old city of Jerusalem. So this is right outside the walls. So Jewish people still have the deed actually to these places, or sometimes these other organizations have found deeds or have been very creative with the deeds. And they basically go to Palestinians and say, this is our house, we have the deed. Now, Israeli courts have been sympathetic to these deeds, but the only problem is that the Palestinians that lost their homes in 1948, of course, is not up to question that they're going to come back. It's only for this one little area that they're allowing Jews to come back, sometimes living together with the Palestinian families in the house. This is over 10 years going on. So the problem is that during this moment, whether it was in Al-Aqsa, the Israeli police, really harsh use of force, or the Sheikh Jarrah, everything around this, convinces more and more people in the U.S. of injustices against Palestinians. This is something that the American Jewish community is going to have to rethink and reimagine. How are they going to, use this as, what's their talking points going to be over this? This is something huge because more and more Americans are saying there's something simply unjust here. Whether you like the squad, it's called the squad of Democrats, or if you like this, like that, it's not just 3 or 4 people talking like this. There is a major shift where people are saying this is unfair. And during this war, Hamas proved it could hit Tel Aviv with bombarded missiles with Israel unable to shift public opinion. The missiles, I've never seen Hamas really give an ultimatum to Israel and Israel come out as the underdog in sense of political legitimacy or political. Hamas played their cards perfectly this time, I have to say. They do often, yeah. Israel's massive bombardment and bombing of Gaza causes widespread death, leading them to lose the international public opinion. It was clear. Yes, Israelis are killed by rockets. Yes, my daughter was there in Tel Aviv and had one fall next to her house. Yes, people in her town died. But when you see the Israeli reprisal attacks or the attacks on Gaza, I'm talking huge, and we all see this. But if we're living in a bubble, if we think that people are going to understand two sides here, it's in that war. So what I'm arguing here is that Netanyahu was able to shelter Israel from all this, but it all came out in the open at one time. Now, in Tirtzu, in Zo Agada, this is the words of Herzl. If you wish, it's not impossible. It can be done. And we see that in the 4th elections. Remember, Israel for 2 years was in 3 elections, and we went to the 4th election. I flew back for 2 elections. Usually they were close to Passover, so I could I could teach online with this last time. This time it was in March. So I voted and I could still teach online. So I taught online, I voted. I went to Turkey also for 2 weeks. I did an extended time. I was teaching at 2 a.m. sometimes there. It was too difficult. I stopped. But these parties that we're going to look at in a second came together. Yesh Atid, which is Yair Lapid, is sort of a staunch secular party. Yamina, by the way, it was Bayat Yehudi here. but I left Jewish Home Party. It's the right-wing party. It's Yamin, it's right. It's not Jewish Home. They left Jewish Home. There's Naftali Bennett and Ayelet Shaked have had so many different parties in the last 4 years that it's hard to keep up in memory which party it is. So in Hebrew I wrote one thing, in English I wrote something else. Then you have Benny Gantz's party, and then you have Gidon Saar's party, formerly Likud. You have the Labor Party, which is about 6 or 7 seats, Merav Michayeli. Then you have Meretz, and then we're going to talk about it, you have the Ram Party, the Arab Islamist party. So they joined together and showed that you can create a government of Israel that is probably the most representative government we have seen in years, with so many different walks of life. I'm sorry I don't know all their names, but we have a woman who has a disability on the right. We have a woman that is deaf and uses sign languages in all her speeches. We have Naftali Bennett, who I'll mention later on, that he's a son of immigrants, American immigrants. He lives in Ra'anana, in my daughter's town. We have Lieberman. It's very, very interesting to see this mishmash of parties. No one believed that they could do it, and they did it. Now, will the government prevail? First of all, I say a bit of normalcy will not hurt Israel. The idea that it's going smoothly for 6 months and there's no scandals, nothing, what is this? And you don't need to turn the news on every 5 minutes and say what crisis is happening now. And last week, the government succeeded in passing the budget for 2021 and 2022. This was a major test, and Israel has a budget for the first time in 4 years, or maybe 3 years. It's huge. The country did not have a budget for quite a few years. Now, some pundits are trying to undermine them completely, and the next test will be the alternating of prime ministership between Bennett and Lapid. So Naftali Bennett is supposed to share the prime ministership with Yair Lapid. After 2 years, we'll see if he actually gives up his seat. Remember, the last elections were because Netanyahu was supposed to switch with Benny Gantz, and then Netanyahu said at the last minute, no, I'm not going to switch. I'm calling new elections again. I'm going to win even more this time. And he didn't get it. So, but people are saying that this is working. Now, if Netanyahu's trials continues and he resigns, this can happen. If his trial, he may resign as the opposition leader, I'm talking about. If his trial moves forward, then, or if a law is passed barring the prime minister from serving with indictments, which they might try to pass, then a new leadership will emerge in the Likud, which is already happening, the stirrings, and this might cause a new government crisis because quite a few members of the government are only there because they're anti-Netanyahu, basically, and they're just waiting for him to leave, waiting for him to step down. So someone like Gidon Saar, for example, or these are Likudniks that finally said, we cannot be in this party anymore. We cannot be in this corrupt party. We cannot be in this party of mafiosos type people over and over, what do you call them? Stooges, political stooges, basically. Now, questions, we only have a few more minutes. Can the new government revive the pro-peace camp? First, the new government has no solution for the future in terms of peace with the Palestinians. Thus, it's more of the same, where the ongoing Palestinian conflict is basically ignored. Unfortunately, this government, because it includes a right-wing pro-settlement movement as the prime minister, Naftali Bennett, there doesn't look like there's going to be any major shift with the Palestinians. Now, Israelis can keep on saying, well, the Palestinian Authority is corrupt. Well, the Palestinian Authority doesn't really represent their people. Well, this or that. It doesn't matter. There are equal amount of Israelis and Palestinians in the land right now, basically. From the sea to the Jordan River, it's about 50-50 now, if you include the Palestinian Israelis as Palestinians. So, the clock is ticking. And we'll come back to that. The recent outlawing of 6 Palestinian human rights groups in the West Bank by Gantz shows perhaps more than anything the limitations of the ideological left party Meretz. So Meretz, you have a left ideological party. You have someone, her name is Gabi Lasky. She's an immigrant from Mexico City. She's a human rights defender, and she also was the lawyer of Aha Tamimi, the Palestinian girl that was jailed for slapping a soldier a couple of years back. It was a very political event that had happened. So you have some really left people in there, but they haven't been able to stop this outlawing of the human rights. Is probably the biggest news, because under Netanyahu this couldn't have happened probably. They probably wouldn't have the legitimacy to do it. But because you have this new government that's mixed, they're able to do it. They're able to do things that other governments would not be able to do. If Netanyahu had done it, I think America would have sent strong message. Well, not under Trump, but and Biden also sent a strong message against it, I have to say, coming back to that, now that I think about it. Still, I say by giving them place within the government, they have more of a chance to rebuild themselves, which perhaps is the best thing for the Israeli political spectrum. So I say, if you're left or right, it doesn't matter. If you like the left, you hate the left, you love the right, you hate the right, it doesn't matter. We need that balance in Israel. We need a strong voice, pro-peace camp, to move forward. Now, I have 3 topics, and then we'll end. Just quickly, we have not new, but the emerging political player that we've seen, the most dynamic one, would be the Palestinian citizens of the state. So don't forget that Israel has 20% are Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, okay? And I always, when I teach the class, I say, don't forget also that there's more Palestinians speak fluent Hebrew, write fluent Hebrew, read Bialik, and read the Torah in Hebrew than Jews outside of Israel. Maybe not the Torah, but besides that, definitely. They're in the Hebrew literature department at Hebrew University was saved because Arab students were taking Hebrew literature also. Okay, so this is really, really fascinating. They're Israelis, but they're also Palestinians. So during the last 5 or 10 years, they united their different parties together into the joint list. The joint list was only created because Avigdor Lieberman raised the election threshold in 2013 in order to push Palestinians out of the parliament together. Then they united into one party. But you have someone like Ahmed Tibi of Tala Party, a dynamic parliamentarian. You have the joint list that's really, I think, brought to the fore demands of that local community. At the same time, they have been delegitimized by all spectrums in the politics. So despite this idea of them wanting change, up until this government, it was like a wall. They said, yes, but you don't do the army, or you don't do this, or you don't do that. And then suddenly Netanyahu sees Mansour Abbas from the Islamist party and props him up as a possible government partner. So when Abbas, after the election, went with the new government, Netanyahu always mentions, oh, you're doing a government with these terrorists. I mean, Netanyahu won't say that. Some of his supporters will say that. But it was Netanyahu that garnered him for this position. And we know they met 4 times in his house. He invited Mansour Abbas to his house. So for the first time, they're in an equal coalition party. I mentioned that this is not the first time Arabs are in the government. There's Arabs within Jewish parties also. The Meretz Party, Labour Party, Likud has a Druze, different groups. So this is not the first time. So what future can Israel build to integrate them is going to be a question. Now, of course, mending the religious-secular divide is a major thing. We're not going to go into every point. I think the most interesting thing here is point number 3, that there are interesting steps to remove the monopoly on religion by the religious establishment, and that's concerning kosher laws and conversion. Many people are upset. They're saying, you know what? We sell only kosher food, but we can't get a kosher license because we open on Saturday. Or we don't do this, and then they won't give us a certificate, even though they're kosher. So they're talking about breaking this monopoly on giving kosher certificates. It's very important. And also over conversion. That would be very important. These things affect Reform and conservative community very, very much so. The good thing is secular Israelis are more pluralistic in their views of secularism, and the generations, we talk about this today, they don't maintain the strict secularness of their parents. You know, younger people are much more fluid. They can discover religion now, and it's not the end of the world. Or religious people, a lot of religious people are blending over more to the secular side also. It's an interesting time to be in Israel in terms of that. I think the breaking down of the ideological state has led to these many interesting groups. To emerge, the Haredi party, unfortunately, tied their fate completely to Netanyahu. It was a huge mistake. And unfortunately, they used to be in all groups. And they lost out on this. And last question, how does Israel move forward, bridging the widening gap? Jerusalem schools have a minority of secular national religious. Hasidic and Haredi schools and Arab schools make up the majority. So in Jerusalem, you see already that the majority of young people are either going to be from Haredi, that's either Ashkenazi, Hasidic, or religious Sephardic, and Arabs. Meaning that thing when we think of Israelis, right? When we watch Israel TV or we see Israeli films, there are places where they're not going to be the majority. And that's going to transform the way the state has to think. Mending relations with Jewish diaspora, I'll just mention that Israel has started to reimagine relations between the two. I think they were hurt quite badly during the Netanyahu years. He forfeited his morals, making friends with people like Orban and anti-Semitic leaders sometimes. And it was very, very unfortunate to see that. Netanyahu's move to replace American Jewish support for right-wing groups, including evangelical and Trump supporters, undermined the liberal Jewish factions based in D.C. I think this is going to come back naturally, but American Judaism is also transforming, as we know. And what is that connection going to be? Under the new government, Bennett, a child of American Jewish family, I look at Bennett and I really see this American in him, that he accepts everyone and respects everyone, and he's very right-doing, so I don't agree with his politics at all. But on this issue, I think he's bringing a new type of. He's the first prime minister with a kippah on his head. Think about that. First prime minister ever with a kippah on his head. First prime minister that keeps kosher. Think about that. Rabbi didn't keep kosher. Netanyahu doesn't keep kosher. Sharon definitely didn't. Sharon prided himself that he would eat pork. So it's the first Israeli prime minister and not by chance, from an American Jewish family. So that's interesting. Now, under the new continued occupation, lack of genuine peace process is placing a growing number of Jews on the other side. This is what I was mentioning before about the last war. And concluding thoughts, I don't know what I did. If you just make it big, we'll just end here. I think most of this I have already mentioned. And Netanyahu years prove that Israel is acceptable to authoritarian type leaders, unfortunately, who do not fear breaking the law in order to persuade voters and public opinion. What's that? What's that?
Netanyahu and Trump.
Yeah, they're they're similarities. So there's about 5 or 6 leaders that there. Netanyahu was much smarter.
I never thought that. That was almost my first thought with your first thing that you had on. Your first,
First slide.
Your first slide. I was like, whoa.
So you're saying this one contradicts that one, or this one?
No.
Oh, okay.
This one's,
Oh, okay. Yeah, I got it clear. Yeah, I got it. Yeah. Okay. The deadlock of 4 elections highlighted deep divisions within the society. Electoral reform might prevent emerging scenarios in the future, but it won't bridge existing gaps. So every time they have electoral reform, it backfires somehow. So I think it's not the system that's bad. It's something deeper. A strong economy, unfortunately, limits peace with Palestinians while strengthening ties with UAE and other countries. It's a very positive thing. Israel now has peace. But once again, peace at home is something very much needed. If Israel wants to secure its future, it's time to start to plan its country not from today until tomorrow, but for decades to come. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. But they need to have long-term planning about what they're going to see their country, what it'll look like, and think of a new type of Israeliness that connects all communities and moves the country forward. That's something that we're going to have to look and transform our understanding of what that means, having a Jewish state and in the land of Israel. So I'll stop there. I hope I said it was going to be lighter than my other 2 talks, but it seems like it might be a little heavier in the end. So, yeah, questions? Yeah, please.
Since you mentioned the Abraham Accords, I know that when they were signed, the leaders of the Palestinians were denouncing the Arab leaders as traitors to them. But among the people, among the actual Palestinians, how do they see it? I mean, the Israeli Palestinians happy that this is happening, or do they feel like, no?
That's a great question. You know, the joint list came out very strongly against it. I wrote an article right after the Accords, and it was actually about Turkey-Israeli relations. But on that note, I said, the UAE is going to promise many of the Israelis, Palestinian Israelis or Israeli Arabs, future work. That's going to be an important outlet because UAE relies on international markets. And Palestinians and Jews both have high education, multiple languages. So I think that transition of a new job market for them is going to be crucial in developing their own community. Officially, their politicians were against it because it did not address the Palestinian issue. It sidelined them actually, very, very much so. But we see Saudi Arabia is still saying we're not moving forward until something happens with the Palestinians. Israel was convinced that Saudi Arabia tomorrow would not join in. They haven't. So we're going to have to see how that. But so I think they're divided. Remember, the Palestinians in Israel also go to school in Turkey. Palestinians in general go to school in Turkey. They go to school in Jordan. They are being much more connected at the same time with the surrounding countries. So I think job markets are important. They will in 20 years be filling a lot of positions there, I believe. They know that too, I think, also. Any other questions?
So you're sure that Netanyahu and Trump don't share any DNA?
That's why the only reason because I said Netanyahu is much smarter than Trump. Yeah, exactly. So unfortunately, we see a lot of leaders that are sharing the rise of leaders taking countries to authoritarian twists. It's unfortunate to see it right now. Yes.
I've been having trouble for more than a decade trying to get my arms around the idea that there's no constitution as we know it here in the States and in other countries in Israel. And there doesn't seem to be any interest in defining more detail in one document, but rather a series of legal cases which tries to interpret the meaning or the intent of the Declaration of Independence, if you will.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Could you repeat the comment, please?
Yeah, so the question was that his surprise that over more than a decade that there's not more interest in Israelis coming up with a constitution. The idea of a constitution has been on the table for so many years, and of course the idea of having a higher law for many of the religious people anything the hints of higher law is something that should be shunned upon. I think that's one thing. I think that's a very important. But how can Israel even imagine? First of all, they have basic laws. Britain doesn't have a constitution either, for example. And Israeli, because of this British mandate, follows British law also. British law is a precedence within Israel. You can use it. So it works on precedents, basically precedents. So let's say the constitution, they have basic laws. They have human rights laws. They have, I think, pretty good system. But you're right, the courts have a lot more leeway in these systems. What though? How are you going to have a constitution with a country that 54 years they don't define their borders? 54 years. Love it or hate it. Love the territories or the settlements, or hate the settlements. The settlements are not on Israeli land by Israeli law. By Israeli law, this is not Israel. Israel never annexed it, right? Netanyahu was going to annex it. People warned them against it, and it didn't happen. Okay. So this is not even Israeli, it's not even Israel, but they're building settlements there. And when they removed the settlements from Gaza in 2005, the people said, you can't remove us, we're citizens. They said, yes, we can remove you, you're not in Israel. And then they removed them. Or most got up and left on their own accord. So that's the question about the Constitution, right? Unfortunately, the nation-state law was probably one of the worst laws Israel could see. It happened about 5 years ago, and I'm hoping that they'll reverse this, because it does place Jews at the top in the sense of having it's their homeland. Palestinians come second. I'm talking about the citizens of the state also. So how can you have a constitution when you have a law like nation-state law? The two contradict each other. So Israel is going to have to decide, are we an ethnic religious state for Jews, like the nation-state law says, or are we for all of our citizens? And if you say all of our citizens, that Israel is going to look very, very different in the long run. I don't know how different it's going to look in it. But once again, without long-term planning, then some vision. So maybe this sort of silence that we're having, normalcy, where you're not having crisis after crisis after crisis, maybe some good things will emerge from this on a positive note. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, everything you did is, everything you taught us is really good, thank you. But my question is, listening to everything, sounds very moralistic and very humanistic to have Israel have a constitution as an example, or recognize the Arab population and try to treat them as equal and give them equal opportunity. This is very nice, but you know what? There's only one Jewish state in this whole world. Why are they not putting these same standards for those other Arab countries surrounding them? Saudi Arabia, Iran, Jordan, Syria. You know, we're putting Israel on a pedestal, like Israel's supposed to be a perfect, humanistic, constitutional government, respecting everybody. But you know what? Jews can't live in Syria. They can't live in Lebanon. They can't own property. So I think before we can address such issues, I think the world has to look at some of those surrounding countries and force them to live by the same rules that they expect Israel to live by.
Yeah. So very, very simple, I can tell you.
Summarize what he said.
Why is Israel put up on a pedestal when the surrounding countries, Jews can't own property in Syria and Jordan, Iran, where there's many more examples. So my answer is, it's a comment, but my answer is very simple. I'm not a citizen, not of Syria or Lebanon, or I'm not a citizen of Turkey, so I don't give talks like this. My talks on Turkey are very different. I give talks on politics in Turkey. Very rarely do I say Turkey should do this or that. I do, but I do it in a very different way. In this case, I'm a citizen of the state. And of course, the connection with the American Jewish diaspora is not one saying, not one looking at the other countries, but trying to say, what do we want our country to, our not our country, but our connection with that Israeli state to be? What does that Israeli state should look like? And that's a really weighted topic, because no one writes for any other citizen. In the end, it's citizens that vote in Israel that decide this. And for the majority of citizens in Israel, these are very important topics. So for the issue of a constitution, for the very majority of Israelis, I would say they're interested in these topics. So that would be my answer. But yeah, I get it that it's easy to say, oh, look at before there was 22 Arab countries against Israel also. Well, now about 8 or 10 countries have peace with Israel also. So things are changing. Things are absolutely changing. Any questions? Yes.
I was just a question about, as we grew up, our view of Israel was just with love and it was incredible. We had to give the money on the table and tzedakah and all that, and plant trees in the name of our children, whatever. Do you think the young kids? I think our young kids and a lot of young kids see it through a social media lens, which is very powerful. And I think this affects how the future is going to lie for Israel, because how could it's sort of on a crash course, I believe, eventually.
I think that's, this idea of social media and virtual worlds and how borders are constructed, strengthened, or broken down also. So yes, social media is very powerful, but we know social media also produces fake news also. So that the idea that you have truth, and then you have the fake news, and then you have the half a truths, I think for young people it's very, very confusing. And I'm hoping that the TikTok generation, Instagram generation is going to find that their future has been sort of misled by this. So I think in overall, we might see more Jewish kids asking questions for sure. And then once you ask these questions and you see the reality on the ground, then that's something very hard for them to deal with. I work at Brooklyn College, and it's 30% Jewish, but what's interesting about Brooklyn College is that it's not one community. So I worked at WashU. WashU in St. Louis was a very sort of heavily pro-Zionist, they were brought up in synagogues, organized community. Brooklyn College is different because it's not one community. So I see a lot of, it's a very different dynamic. So we're not coming up, why am I bringing this up? Because there's the question of anti-Semitism on campuses and stuff like that. A lot of it is just anti-Israeli sentiments. And people seeing these social medias. I mean, in May, the pictures we're seeing from Gaza were horrific. Death is death. Death is horrific when it's done by a rocket. If it's one person or if it's 100 people. But when you have 100 people and you have whole neighborhoods decimated, how do you explain that to children or young people? How do you use that? What's your arguing point? You bring it, and so people are gonna have to ask questions. And hopefully, once again, in this post-Netanyahu era, people will start asking questions also again in Israel, because they woke up. I think it was a cold water shower, you say, or something like that. Yep. Okay, thanks so much for the 3 days, 24 hours, 3 lectures. The diehards that have been here, so many of you, everyone, it's my pleasure. And I feel like, I know you, which doesn't happen. Even when I teach sometimes classes, I don't have the warmth that I have from all of you. So thanks so much. It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Don't go far. Don't go far. We are so grateful, Louis, for all of your wisdom and your sense of humor and your presentation. I have enjoyed our private conversations as well, and learned so much more. You mentioned a warm feeling. Well, we want you to continue that warm feeling, and so we're giving you our world-famous Temple Beth Or mug so that you can have your favorite warm beverage, or cold, either way, as well, so that way you will remember your time here
Thanks so
at
much.
Temple
I'm
Beth
a
Or.
avid coffee drinker, and I only drink from mugs. This is about the perfect size, so thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Great, excellent. We are going to conclude our time together, and again, let's, a round of applause for Louis Fishman, and the stimulating information that we have shared together has been wonderful. We're going to conclude with our Havdalah ceremony. Here, let me get this up and running. And afterwards, there's still some more dessert for those who would like a little more sugar or chocolate, or fruit is also available before we head home. It's been a fabulous week, and I'm so grateful again to Stuart Williger and the Sylvia Williger Shabbaton Fund. I'm also grateful for all those who have helped set up and clean up. Leslie Berger, David Sane, Joe Teas, Harry Jacobs, Victoria Jacobs, Karen Sane, Helene Moss, Charlene Brotman, David Youngman, yes, absolutely, and David Youngman and Phil Carey for streaming everything for our presentations. All of this is up on our YouTube channel, so for those who have felt maybe maybe I dozed off for a little bit, or maybe that sugar buzz prevented me from fully understanding, you can go to our YouTube channel and you can revisit the presentations there. And I'm just grateful for all of you for being here. Those of you watching us online on our YouTube channel, thank you very much for being a part of our Shabbaton weekend. Let me get our Havdalah stuff. Our Havdalah symbols include, of course, a little Kiddush wine. We are grateful for the sweetness of Shabbat, the energy, the enthusiasm of coming to Shabbat. Spices, the Neshama Yetera, our extra soul, the energizing part of our intellectual weekend, this weekend. And a braided candle reminding us of how intertwined all of our lives are. That David Fishman should be a member of our congregation, whose brother Louis Fishman is a world-renowned scholar and professor of history. All of these things combined together in such a beautiful way. We have shared each other's presence, we have shared light and enlightenment and enrichment. And with that, we share in our Havdalah.
La 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei peri hagafen Borei peri hagafen La 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei meorei b'nei mesamim Borei minei besamim La 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Borei meorei ha'esh Borei meorei ha'esh La 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 la. Hamavdil ben kodesh lechol chatotenu imchol zarenu v'chaspenu yarbe kachol v'chakochavim balayla. Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua tov, Shavua tov. Eliyahu hanavi, Eliyahu hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Bimhera v'yamenu, Yahavo Eleinu, Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben David, Eliyahu hanavi, Eliyahu hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi.
Shavua Tov, everyone. With this, we bring to an end not only our Shabbat, but also our Shabbaton weekend. Louis Fishman, thank you so very much. Shavua Tov, everyone.